Alright, so this is going to be the second half, the kind of follow-up to my previous video that I did on American history. I really recommend you watch that one because I'm probably going to be pulling on some of those concepts here. I'll put a little card there for it in the upper right. It's Dissonant Right History of America. And the reason that I'm splitting it into two halves, which is something I'm usually pretty apprehensive to do, something I usually have a degree of apprehension to, is because, well, on the one hand, that's a pretty long video, and combining the two, this would probably end up being like 2 hours long. But also because they're really answering two different questions. The previous video was answering a question of origin, which is very important, and a lot of people don't think it's very important, but claim to origin, claim to originality, allows you to make certain legislative decisions with a degree of almost religious backing that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And I find a lot of these contests for origin, or a lot of these claims to origin, especially on the left, go virtually uncontested. The claim to origin in terms of equality, we saw the unfulfilled promise of democracy narrative is very big. But yeah, you see these motifs repeated a lot, and there's also a motif on the right. There's this libertarian 1776 myth, I call it, and both are heavily flawed, and the real claim to origin is actually very reactionary, very strongly reactionary in America. And so I sort of sort that out, because that's a very important thing to keep in your mind as you're talking about the intent of America, as you're talking about the legislative structure, legislative changes that you want to see made. That claim to origin is a very powerful tool that the left and libertarian right will use to pass through or to justify some of their decisions, really without much justification at all. And today we're going to be answering a very different question. Today we're going to be answering basically, when was America ever great? You know, it's something you'll hear a lot, especially with Trump's slogan, Make America Great Again. You'll hear leftists say, well, when was America ever great? Usually what they mean by that is, well, black people couldn't vote, or it was illegal to discriminate against black people, or women couldn't vote, or something like that. And that's sort of obviously silly. The common, reactionary right-wing retort to that is, well, when we think of societies that were great in history, when we think of Rome, when we think of Hellenistic Greece, when we think of Persia or Egypt, we don't think, oh, every single civilian in all of these countries, or every single resident in all of these countries was completely equal to all the others. We don't care about that. Egypt, Rome, Persia, they had slaves, so that's not what we're talking about when we call civilization great. There's heuristics for greatness. Are you going to be remembered a long time from now? Is your art innovative and reflective of your culture as a whole? Stuff like that. But furthermore, I think it's important to answer the question a little bit more, because aside from that common reactionary retort of what about Rome, what about Greece, etc., we need to really identify when America was great. When you probe a lot of people, even paleoconservatives, even people that tend to have a very good idea, a very formulated idea of American greatness, American intentionality, when they're prompted on what era of America is best to return to, they'll usually answer quite pragmatically the 50s. Because the 50s are, not without reach. They're within reach. And there were a lot of noticeably better things. Although I would argue that approach is flawed because it's basically privative. You're arguing that, and you're correctly arguing that today we have certain social impulses, people are impelled to do certain things socially, which harm a superior social structure that we had in the 50s, and that is correct, but really that's purely an argument through privation. You want to make basically an apophatic legal action. You want to take away from the current legal structure, defining your goal in a negative sense. Whereas I think we need to go even further than that. It is very good to assert that the state that we have it now is sort of unnaturally compelling people towards a deficient social state, I guess. A social state that's not maintainable, that's overly harsh on special people, perhaps that's overly harsh on the majority of people. I agree with that. But furthermore, greatness is not just security on the inside. That is definitely an antecedent to greatness, I believe. But furthermore, we should look at when America was really definitionally great, like Rome was once definitionally great. And, the criteria for that are a little bit more difficult. You might have to look at how the rest of the world felt about us. You might have to look at the rate of expansion that we had internally. You might have to look at how we felt about ourselves at the time. But even more, and I'm not going to go very deep into this, this all has roots sort of outside of simply American culture. I remember during the Vosh video last time, Vosh was, very perturbed and upset by Trump saying that America is itself the follow-up to the antecedent of Western civilization as a whole. And Vosh is very clearly perturbed and upset by that idea, but really it's very true, and it's undeniably true. America does have those unique folkways that I enumerated in the previous video, the 4 folkways that constitute American folk culture, but furthermore, the Spenglerian idea of culture on a sort of larger level, that is sort of a superstrate on top of those 4 American cultures, that's real as well, and that orients a lot of the decisions that we made. So I want to keep in your mind that Spenglerian idea of Faustian civilization as we go through this. If you don't know what that is, then perhaps I'll make a video covering it specifically in the past, but a lot of my videos sort of handle it indirectly, and I might link one of those in a card right now. But anyway, let's continue. Keeping in mind our ideas of the 4 American cultures and Faustian civilization in the sense of David Hackett Fischer. So recapping on what David Hackett Fischer talks about in the Civil War, he says, as we saw, that the North exceeded the South in railroad mileage by 2.4 to 1, in total wealth by 3 to 1, in merchant ships by 9 to 1, in industrial output by 10 to 1, in firearms production by 32 to 1, and in coal mining by 38 to 1. So they were far more productive as a country. The New English culture happened upon a really nice material circumstance that they did not just use very irresponsibly. They took their material circumstances, they had certain natural mineral deposits where they were, and they used it to create an engine of production that lasted for a long time instead of just wasting it, like you'll see a lot of third world countries do with, IMF grants, stuff like that, IMF loans, rather. We did not do that. We did not waste it. The New English took hold of their resources and made a very efficient industrial production mechanism that really fueled their defeat of the South in the Civil War. It was very important. But after the Civil War, and you start to see this crop up around the 1890s, we see that the background, the fundament of that industry ended up solidifying the possibility for, these techno-industrialists, J.P. Morgan, Henry Ford, John Rockefeller. They start to emerge and they become very important in this era of American history, the era commonly called the Progressive Era, although I don't like that term because it's not specifically the period I'm referring to. These are kind of almost monopolists. When we look back on American history, and we look back on, say, the Gilded Age, but especially the era of J.P. Morgan, Henry Ford, John Rockefeller, we tend to see them as monopolists that the government had to, strike down. And there's definitely something to that, but I think furthermore, we need to go deeper on a societal level with the economy and what, monopolies really mean to an economy, because that's pretty much the only strong critique you'll get of these people that's not purely emotional, that these people were monopolists and that the monopolies, harmed the economy, how they are expected to do in the neoclassical model. But I would sort of counteract that claim about monopolies, typically that they reduce competition, they make the economy stagnant, stuff like that, by countering with what Peter Thiel says in his book 0 to 1, very good book. In the unedited or in the edited version of this book, he claims that monopolies are essentially not a very bad thing. There's sort of a scale of degrees of competition. On the one end, there's perfect competition. There's an infinite number of firms providing undifferentiated product, and there's immediate and constant equilibrium in the market. And on the other end, there's monopolistic competition where, a market has only one firm providing, and it would hypothetically never reach equilibrium. And in Thiel's view, we should always choose the latter of those two things. We should always choose monopoly over perfect competition. Because he sees the opposite of what people typically see in the economy. Peter Thiel says that the former, perfect competition, stifles all growth in the economy. If there's constant competition, there's no R&D, there's no leisure spending in the company. There's no dangerous or risky ventures. As we know from the stock market, risky ventures and risk tend to be how you make big changes. That's, of course, how venture capital works, that's how the stock market works, it's how speculation works in general. Risk is less certain, but tends to have greater rewards when it moves positively. So, quoting Thiel directly on this measure of equilibrium and stuff like that, he says, "Why are economists obsessed with competition as an ideal state? It's a relic of history. In business, equilibrium means stasis, and stasis means death. If your industry is in a competitive equilibrium, the death of your business won't matter to the world. Monopoly is the condition of every successful business." And he goes on to substantiate this to a pretty decent degree. The companies that tend to be the most innovative, the companies that tend to, through creative destruction, supersede the previous technologies. We see this with lots of things on the internet. We see, for example, Apple, when they make the smartphone, through creative destruction, supplant the monopoly that Microsoft had on the market for devices on the industry level, for personal computer OSs, stuff like that. And that sort of supplanting, and by supplanting the previous company becoming a monopoly, of course, I would say that in a lot of ways, Apple, for at least in the early days, did hold a monopoly on cell phones. In fact, as Peter Thiel mentions in his book, they actually patented the method of a touchscreen altogether. So, and of course, that didn't go very well for them, but they did indeed try to patent it because, as he says, monopoly is the condition of every successful business. And it's not just that through creative destruction you naturally become a monopoly. It's that monopolies tend to engage in degrees of leisure spending that create new technologies that can be very, very profitable. And we actually see this quite a bit with those techno-industrialists from the 1890s to the 1930s in America. They fund, a ton of stuff. They fund Nikola Tesla's World Wireless Project. They fund the Nationalistische Jagdflugzeugmaschinenzahlenamt. They fund lots of political movements in Europe, which we'll get to. They fund the first highway system in America, the Lincoln Highway System. Modern rocketry was funded in this way. The greatest American architects of all time, Frank Lloyd Wright, Hugh Ferris. I mean, these guys are excellent architects that sort of defined the image of America. They really forged on their own this kind of Faustian architectonic, the New York City skyscrapers, the New York City architecture of that time, which the rest of the world really still continues to follow. They still sort of mimic. You really, at least in looking at the architecture of skyscrapers today, you can definitely see the echoes of Frank Lloyd Wright and Hugh Ferris there. They really manifest the spirit of Faustian civilization quite a bit, those people. And I might have to make a video on architecture all on its own at some point, but for now we can just accept this method of monopolist, techno-industrialists funding smaller people, funding innovators was a very efficient mechanism for production, a very efficient mechanism for R&D, for creating new technologies. Of course, Nikola Tesla invents electricity as we have it today, but additionally, his concept of wirelessly transmitting electricity, that actually lays the foundation for the internet, sort of, in that, using IEEE 802.11 or whatever it's called, that whole standard is about using tiny amounts of electricity in the air through radio waves to transmit packets over the internet, to transmit, useful information. So we see the reflections of all of this technology, in the future. Obviously, modern rocketry ends up leading to the nuclear bomb. The highway system ends up being the antecedent for the Eisenhower highway system, which I have some problems with, but we'll get to that in a moment. This was a very, very productive way for America to grow, and we did grow a lot at this period. We were pretty much the peak of the world. At the very least, New York City was the peak city of the planet at this time. There's this sort of a feeling in New York City of the time of a vision that looks towards the future while not compromising on the fundamental spirit behind it. The future city, the world city of the future, becomes a strong concept, a strong idea in this era of American history. And it wasn't really just the consequence of those material circumstances, right? It's far more than just they had the money and they wanted to spend it. There's something further in that there's sort of an intention behind all of this. There's kind of a background of culture, and this is where I'll pull back to Faustian civilization. It's where I'll pull back to that New English sort of a culture, the idea of ordered liberty that we had at the time, and our reactionary background as America, where there's kind of a clash of two ideas here that actually ends up being very useful for America, a very productive dialectic. And on the one hand, we have the civilizational stage of Faustian society. Now, what does that mean? Oswald Spengler basically sees every single culture on the planet and throughout history as having a fundamental idea. And for Faustian civilization, which is ours, it's Western civilization, it's inaugurated with Charlemagne in the 9th century, I believe. The idea in this culture is infinity, right? Our fundamental idea is, infinite space, the infinitesimal in some sense, so infinite precision and detail, the function, so infinite productivity, things like this. It's sort of hard to explain fundamentally what that means, but it gets reflected in every sector of Faustian culture, of Faustian high culture. Spengler, of course, he looks to the Gothic Cathedral, and he says, I believe this is a direct quote, that architectonic is mathematics in stone, with an eye to the Gothic Cathedral style, basically pointing out that that idea of infinite productivity, of infinite space, is reflected in the Gothic Cathedral, which is meant to make you feel small. It's meant to have little details, stuff like arabesques, stuff like buttresses on the which get developed through the Faustian architectural style. All of these ideas are meant to have an infinite degree of precision and an indistinction on the infinitesimal scale, whereas give you a sense of infinite space on the individual scale, right? And all of this, connects back to that fundamental idea of infinity. But Spengler has another idea which is very important that goes beyond just Faustian culture. He sees this happen in every society, where there's a transition from a cultural stage, a stage that handles abstract things, that handles philosophy, art, stuff like that, purely for philosophy's sake, purely for art's sake, things like that. We end up making a shift where we begin to orient, after around 1,000 years of that cultural stage, into what Spengler calls the civilizational stage, in contradistinction to the cultural, where we stop caring about art for art's sake. We stop caring about philosophy for philosophy's sake. And instead we orient ourselves towards expansion, towards reification, towards grasping the world in our hands, stuff like that. Spengler sees this turn begin with Napoleon, around the time of Napoleon, and there's a lot of justification for that. The Napoleonic Wars were some of the first non-gentlemanly wars in Western history. Previously there was almost a code of battle, a code of conduct with battle and warfare that in some ways Napoleon radically overturned. And Spengler talks about this, but it's a very important change that happened around this time. We stopped caring about philosophy for philosophy's sake. We stopped caring about maybe art for art's sake. Of course, people individually do care about that, but something changed in the society as a whole where we begin to orient towards reification and expansion and conquest, things that really, you're noticing, should define the American spirit as a whole. And there's sort of an issue with just that level of expansion where it can become kind of simplistic and single-minded. I mean, you could imagine kind of like tech worship is sort of like this. The Redditor techno worship sort of a person is sort of someone who just thinks in terms of pure expansion with no fundamental ordering principle. There's no more spirit behind it. There's no more fundamental idea that backs and gives the fundament to this broader civilizational property of expansion and reification. All they care about is expansion and reification. And there's obviously lots of flaws with that. That's no longer civilizational expansion, that's just expansion for its own sake, which is really deficient. Jean Gebser analyzes this too in terms of people who think with a rational mindset, people who think in terms of, pure like lab coat rationality. These people have an efficient state. There's an efficient mode of rationality when you're using, say, science and technology, rational thinking to solve problems. That's very efficient. But it becomes deficient when people start to hypertrophy the ego, is what Jean Gebser says. When people start to think of themselves, all individuals, as completely atomized units, separate from any civilization, completely separate from the centers that they operate with, that's very deficient. And when you see those Redditor techno worship people, I freaking love science types, they begin to occupy that deficient mental state, that, Jean Gebser sort of a deficient rational state of mind, where they hypertrophy the ego and they think only in terms of expansion for expansion's sake. There's sort of a deep connection there, and of course you also see it, the rise of hypertrophic individualism is concomitant with this techno-worship, this very simplistic thing, which I'll cover in a moment. But it's good to keep in mind that America has, on the one hand, that level of expansion and conquest as a fundamental idea, but we also counter it with something equally important, which is a way to just avoid being this purely liberal, purely expansionist, very simplistic techno-worship society. The way that we get around that is with ordered liberty in a lot of ways. We saw in the previous video, Thomas Jefferson thought he was fighting for the liberties of his Saxon ancestors, and that degree of just, I want liberty for myself so that I can do stuff, is very destructive when you combine it with that idea of expansion. It turns into this complete decadence that is completely, inadvisable. It can't continue, entirely infeasible. And what we counter it with, and part of why the North was so productive with these techno-industrialists and with this degree of industry, is because we had ordered liberty. We had a concept of liberty of the group, sort of. Individuals who will sacrifice their own potential to, just do stuff, this sort of negative liberty, for the positive liberty of the group being able to survive on its own, the liberty of England, the liberty of Boston, the liberty of Massachusetts, stuff like that. So that is to say, we didn't just care about how we ourselves were. We did not just care about decadence and complete liberalism and libertarianism. We cared about kind of a care for the group and self-determination of the group, a kind of sort of a reflection of will to power, but definitely not in those terms. Definitely self-determination, though, is something that was very important for us, and we understood if you do things that are technically development, like mass media, television, pornography, those are technically development, those are technically expansion, but they're not rate-limited by the fundamental idea of ordered liberty, of self-determination of the group. The argument that, say, porn is free speech is one perfect example of this. You're treating it as if there's a negative liberty, this, pure, I want to do what I want sort of liberty. You're treating that as superior to the idea of self-determination of the group. But really, we understood in the past that that's not true, that's impossible. Every individual relies on the group. If you supervene onto the group with your own individual desires and whims, that ends up destroying the group and thereby destroying yourself, since you, of course, rely on it. Even Marx understood this. Marx says this On the Jewish Question. Basically, individuals rely on their society as a whole. Of course, he's saying it in a very different context from what I am. But anyway, keeping in mind those two counteracting impetuses, keeping in mind the, on the one hand, expansionary Faustian civilizational aspect that only cares about reification, and on the other hand, keeping in mind the rate limiting of our sort of New English ordered liberty, the understanding of self-determination, and the orientation towards God and Christianity that all help to combine these two in a really positive way. We see, again, some of the best innovations, some of the best development in American history from this period, from 1890 to 1939. We see, as before, these great skyscrapers, the mass production of the automobile, we see the first highway system get made, rocketry, all this stuff. All of it is because we were not just expanding for expansion's sake. We were expanding with a broader goal in mind. Why would J.P. Morgan have funded Nikola Tesla if he just wanted to keep himself secure? If he were just completely rent-seeking and individualistic, there would be no reason to fund Nikola Tesla. And that actually ends up becoming the downfall of Nikola Tesla, because this is around the period where you start to see individualism take hold, but, through John Rockefeller. But that's, more than I can get into here. Just good to keep in mind for now that there's this dialectic between two forces and two wills, which is very important here. You can't avoid that if you're only focusing on, ordered liberty, on self-determination, well, you're not going to go anywhere because, you need some sort of creativity, some sort of innovation, some sort of change to stay relevant, to stay powerful. You need at least a little bit of power, right? And if you just care about the Faustian civilizational sort of impetus, which is expansion and conquest, with a fundamental idea of infinity behind it, then you also won't go anywhere, because, infinity to what end? If you're just expanding and expanding and expanding, if there's no fundamental goal, then, eventually you'll lead to this hypertrophic ego, the hypertrophic individualism, where everyone's this completely atomized unit and they don't have any connection to the group at all. And that's also very, very deficient. It's very, very harmful. So keeping in mind that we had this great dialectic going on that made us insanely productive, I mean, it's hard to describe to modern people how far ahead New York City was compared to the rest of the world, compared to, say, London. But we were insanely well developed at this time. And as a nation as a whole, it's not just New York City, but that was sort of the jewel of America at the time. We had a massive amount of growth, and it was, very admirable. And we still have that impetus of Faustian civilization, the late culture of the Faustian world spirit. But there's something else that's going on now, and unfortunately we kind of lost that idea of ordered liberty, the idea of self-determination. It's obvious when you look around today, people still care a lot about that, ever-present expansion, about that hypertrophic individualism through rationality. They care a lot about infinity and, completely negative liberty, stuff like that. But we've sort of lost a care for ordered liberty, for care about the group, for self-determination on a group level, right? And it's also very noticeable that America has not been developing in the same way as we were previously. Obviously, you can pull up any number of graphs and it looks like our economy is doing better than ever. But, as Thomas Carlyle said, answering the question of what is the condition of a nation economically is always fundamentally an aesthetic judgment. And I'm arguing from a specific Spenglerian perspective, aesthetically speaking, that America has become a lot less productive economically. And, clearly that's true if you compare the greatest period of America, compare us in the 1890 through 1939 period to the rest of the world. There were no more New York cities. It was like the only one. Skyscrapers were just an American thing. Our great architecture was unique to America. All of our inventions were very unique to America, and the rest of the world was playing catch-up. But there's kind of a point in American history where stuff starts to become a little bit more equal, right? And we've stopped making, and Peter Thiel really understands this, we've continued to develop economically. You can look at a graph and see the arrow go up and be like, oh, stuff is great. But really, Peter Thiel understands this really intuitively. There's a difference between economic development that goes from 1 to n, just making an existing technology better, what Thiel calls horizontal development, and then there's 0 to 1 development, hence the name of his book, which means basically taking a technology that did not once exist, taking a function that was at 0 in terms of whoever was answering it, and shifting it up to 1, giving an answer to a question. Making a startup or a company that resolves a problem in a completely unique way, a way that confers creative destruction onto the market. And, Thiel understands this more than basically anybody, and we've kind of lost that. Our last hope of that was basically the dot-com bubble in recent history, but there was a, as we'll cover in a moment, or perhaps in another video, strong reaction against that sort of spirit that we had during the dot-com bubble in America of, we're on the frontier. We're the new world city, just like we were in the progressive era, that we can forge this new economic state driven by, conquest and innovation and creation. But sadly, we lost hold of that, and a lot of it is because, as I'll argue, again, perhaps in another video, the dot-com bubble is a very complex subject that has to be covered on its own, but I'll argue for American history at least, we've seen a rapid decline as a result of losing that degree of ordered liberty, and shifting our lens onto a frame of negative liberty. Liberty only in the sense of I can do what I want, which is what, New England had been fighting against for a long time. The New English culture did not have this concept of liberty. The New English culture had a concept of, again, ordered liberty, completely opposed to this idea of negative liberty. There's a strong difference between we should submit our own will to further the group for self-determination of whatever group we rely on, versus I should be allowed to do whatever I want because, I'm an egoist or something like that. That latter is very, very silly. But it's started to crop back up, unfortunately. And why was that? Well, we were kind of continuing, we were kind of coasting on this spirit of greatness in America through the 30s and 40s and World War II, and then we do the Marshall Plan after World War II, which makes America a very big, important, nation for trade, probably the most important of the time, and that sort of still remains, but it would almost get counteracted and interrupted by another almost concomitant event that happens right after, which is that between the late 40s and early 60s, you start to see a lot of social changes happen. All at once. You see a strong decrease in fertility, a decrease in church going, a decrease in marriage, stuff like that, and a spike in interstate travel for work, a spike in the rate of broadcast television, mass media, a spike in divorce, stuff like that. And it's sort of difficult to answer why that was, but at the very least, we can see church going and Christianity decrease quite a bit, and this is the area where you start to see atheism crop up as a serious identity in America. And that definitely took a pretty strong blow to the idea of ordered liberty. Obviously, for the New English, their fundamental principle was to build a Zion in America, to build a new, homeland for the Christian people. And part of that is their idea of, ordered liberty. Just like there's a kind of order to the universe with God on top. God is the fundamental patriarch, and the whole world is ordered beneath him. All the other forces as emanating out of him, his divine energies emanating out of his divine essence, and the two other persons of the Trinity emerging out of the Father. Well, they don't believe that because they're not Orthodox, but they believe at least that fundamental structure of the patriarch and his, subservient world. They see, just like was argued in Robert Filmer's book Patriarcha, the reaction to which ends up developing liberalism entirely, that there is a natural, almost familial structure to nature that is divinely reflected, that is reflected in the structure of God and in the structure of Christian cosmology, right? It was very important for the early Americans to maintain this spirit of liberty, which is reflected in their cosmology. And as church-going decreases, there's a very strong argument to be made that the reduction in that specific Calvinist religious spirit, was contingent for this other change where people start to accept negative liberty for the first time. They start to separate from the group. They start to, hypertrophy the ego, as Jean Gebser would say. And, this purely negative liberty, I want to do stuff, I want to be allowed to do stuff that I want, that sort of a spirit starts to crop up, which is very, very harmful. That kind of sucks. And you do see this is around the period where, great American development slows down. After the recession in the 70s, there's a noticeable slowing in terms of that 0 to 1 innovation that Peter Thiel talks about. We've only really seen 2 or 3 real developments over from the 70s to today. We obviously have computation, and then, the internet's not really one invention, but at least Web 2.0, the dot-com bubble, that era. And then we see Web 3, which is developing today. And that's not very much compared to what we have from 1890 to 1939. We developed the skyscraper, electricity, the highway, mass production of the automobile, rocketry. Now, that's like a much, much bigger 0 to 1 shift. Of course, as I said before, the graph is still going up, graph go burr, but it's more than that. The 0 to 1 innovation has sort of been slowing down in some sense, and I would also argue a lot of those inventions of, the personal computer, and then contingent on that, the dot-com bubble and the sort of internet, dot-com Web 2.0 era, and after that, the Web 3 era, artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial revolution, all of that is kind of artificial. A lot of it is innovation with almost unseen consequences that was only developed to the end of that negative liberty, and we're starting to see the negative consequences of a lot of these inventions. And I'll argue that that's perhaps in another video also a result of this, reduction in positive liberty, the reduction in ordered liberty, and its, supplanting with negative liberty and, the modern form of libertarianism that people believe in when they proclaim themselves to be a libertarian. But yeah, that's very important to keep in mind. There was a decrease in church going, a sort of disruption of the family structure. People stopped having children as much, and then this is the era where we start to see broadcast television gets really popular. Mass media becomes extremely important through this period. And you see a lot of divorce. Yeah, all of that. There's kind of a moral power vacuum that comes out of all of that. And, it's good to think in terms of that moral power vacuum. Who's going to fill it? After we lose the spirit and the cosmology of Calvinist Christianity, the essence of which was left in the air, but the actual structure of which had, begun to diminish and was definitely not the civilizational ordering principle that it used to be. What replaced it? What supplanted it? Where did we go next? There's kind of a power vacuum there, and it did end up getting filled. To answer who filled it, your mind might jump to a couple figures, but let's think of a good first principles, kind of a heuristic for how we might find out where it is today. People had a very religious zeal, obviously, about Calvinism. It's, actually a religion. So there's a degree of religious zeal about it, a degree of, it's the fundamental moral principle, maybe. All your morals are sort of compared to the center of that Christianity, of that form of Christianity. Your cosmology, your metaphysics might all refer back to that fundamental structure. And, what do we have today for that? A lot of people will look back at, say, the Victorian era and talk about how averse they were to sex, and, they'll see that as a fundamental ethical orientation of the Victorian society. We had something similar in a very different way in America, where, it's not negative, it's not harmful like the aversion to sex was for the Victorians, but we certainly had a degree of moral comparison and a moral center in Calvinist Christianity in America. What do we have today? Well, think of the sort of, cultural signal that people have an immediate negative reaction to. There's some words that people have a negative, emotional, and pragmatic reaction to before they even really compute it, right? Perhaps people will know, one good example that Luke Smith gives is okay, if you see a kid walking around with a Soviet Union t-shirt or a Stalin t-shirt, that'll be taken as maybe weird, maybe autistic, maybe degenerate even, but never harmful. It's never we never really assign moral worth to it. Unless you're someone who's from Russia, or you care a lot about politics and you're a hardcore libertarian, which is, kind of a lot rarer than people would expect. No one really gets approached with that. I know, because I used to be that kid, and it was really, really cringe, but I used to be that kid when I was 13 or something, and you never really get approached for it. It's never it never requires reproachment. But then imagine if a kid were walking around with a full swastika t-shirt, and they had a Hitler, Hitler's face on the back of their t-shirt or something like that. Even though people maybe know rationally in their mind that Stalin and Hitler, Stalin killed drastically more people than Hitler, and that those two actions were very equal in brutality, despite one being much larger in quantity. People know that rationally, but they don't really care. They have this emotional reaction that is given to them by society beforehand, right? That's a good template for the sort of emotional, immediate reaction that people have to events that needs to be noticed. This is a big part of getting red-pilled, right? As Luke Smith says, the red pill is really noticing these emotional, pragmatic reactions, which, I could do a more serious sort of postmodern interpretation of how those come about, but at the very least noticing these hyper-real signs, these hyper-real semiotes that are Nazism, racism, democracy, terms like that. Moldbug has another bit where he'll talk about how democracy, positive correlation always. If you say we want to democratize foreign policy, that's always a good thing. But if you say we want to politicize foreign policy, that doesn't sound so good. You'll actually notice the thing that people mean when they refer to these two concepts is exactly the same. Maybe the definition of politics is different from the definition of democracy, but when people say politics and they say democracy, the process behind that is actually exactly the same. In fact, in America, the structure behind that is exactly the same. We're not a democracy, and we shouldn't be, but when people say our democracy in America, we know what they're referring to. They're referring to politics. So how does it come about that two words, which mean the exact same thing, in terms of how people, actually use them, have such a different pragmatic implication? Well, really, it's pretty obvious. There are signs that are manipulated by people with power for there to be, really immediate and emotional responses to them, pre-rational responses. And a good way to tell where religious zeal lies, and therefore to see what filled that moral power vacuum in America, is to see what today we have that degree of moral outrage for. Immediate, pre-societal, emotional outrage. Of course, you might not fall into these categories, but you should recognize the vast majority of Americans do. Well, why do these hate hoaxes keep happening? Maybe that's a good question to see where the religious zeal lies. Faking attacks against a group is something you usually only see in religious circumstances. Why is it that Jussie Smollett and I believe 15 others since then did fake hate crimes against themselves? Well, there's a weird kind of, semiotic, how'd you say this? Incantation there, almost. That there is a negative thing done and there needs to be a counteraction societally. Of course, I can't say why particularly they did that as individuals, but I can certainly say that part of their motivation would have to be that they believed there would be such a strong societal reaction, one that we don't have to, say, murder or rape, which happens constantly in our country, but they would have towards this specific kind of hate crime brought up by, a celebrity of all people. And, they certainly believed, all the people that did this, that there would be a societal reaction to somebody, or at the very least a positive, reaction and conference onto them, onto, say, Jussie Smollett, as a result of it. So they have an expectation of that immediate, hyper-real, pre-rational engagement with the hate hoaxes. So that's one example. The way people react to hate crimes, there's an expectation of pre-rational, immediate, emotional outburst at. So that's one thing. Hate crimes we have a religious zeal towards in our modern country. So these things get a ton of social attention. What other things can we find? Well, racism, of course, is another thing. The reaction to you have an emotional outburst at racism doesn't tend to be no, I don't. It tends to be yes, but I can justify it. So that's one very good example. People do not have an immediate emotional outburst to I don't know, if you think the American Revolution was fake, that's another thing that Moldbug says. You can say that we should still be part of Britain and people won't care, but if you say something that's racist, well, that's very different. Well, why is that? The only justification people give for such an adverse emotional reaction to racism is that it harms society. Well, I could make an equally rational, equally justifiable argument that American independence was far better than the alternative, but obviously people have an emotional reaction that is not just computed, it's not just rational, it's given to them pre-rationally, it's given to them societally. It's a hyper-real sign, racism. Which is also part of what the definition of racism is changes constantly. I think it changed 3 times over the course of 2012 to 2020 in Merriam-Webster, but I'd have to check in particular. So that's another one. Racism and hate crimes, we see people have a pre-society, and democracy, as before, people have a pre-rational societal reaction to, an emotional one. So those are very interesting examples, and if you're just thinking in terms of intent and belief, there's not really a common thread between democracy and hate crimes and racism. I mean, maybe you could say leftism, but what leftism is, then you'd get into this whole discussion about why leftism is the way it is, why leftism is a thing, why are they focusing on race so much more than class now, You would have to get in a difficult discussion about the whole structure of leftism in America, which is way too difficult to do. So instead, what I think is easy to show is that all of these things really, really help people in power, or at least please people in power, so it's easy to infer that it helps them. Who are the organizations that tend to fund anti-racism operatives in America, operations in America? The Tides Fund, the Open Societies Foundation, Act Blue, these organizations, they're international, so they don't get counted in metrics of American funding. But in terms of the political capital that they throw around, I think the OSF alone overwhelm every single strictly conservative organization in America combined. And so, there's a lot of money there, and a lot of what the OSF focus on is anti-racism. Of course, they fund Black Lives Matter to the tune of, I think, $220 million, and the organization as a whole has, I believe, $34 billion. So, you know, they're probably doing more actions than just funding Black Lives Matter, but that's one easy example, $220 million to them. Good example of people in power who really care about anti-racism. Why do they care about it? Well, it's probably because it helps them. At the very least, it doesn't hurt them, and it's quite weird that all of the rich and powerful people happen to believe in this one thing, right? Did they all just come upon it at once? Probably not. It probably helps them in this specific circumstance. This is a case that we know is true of democracy, right? In Chris Bond's book Nemesis, he covers the development of democracy in various societies, but we know that in the case of Athens, what it basically was these family traditional lines, these subsidiary middle centers of power, being taken over by the central authority, which previously people didn't care a lot about. People didn't care a ton about the king. They cared about maintaining their religious family lines, their ancestor worship. What the king did is essentially legislate away family worship and put power in the people who did not have those long ancestral lines to overthrow that middle power structure. For a detailed analysis on that, I really recommend you read Nemesis by Chris Bond. A lot of people call it like a simplistic book. I really like it. But that's a good example of the conditions under which democracy tends to emerge, and under which I would say democracy always emerges. You see it in the French Revolution as well. People with a lot of power will use people with slightly less power to push out of significance, to push out of relevance people with a middle amount of power, people who have subsidiary amounts of power. The king in Athens, for example, uses people without these ancestral family lines to push out the people with these ancestral family lines, so that the only threat to the king's power, those, religious factions that I forget the name of them, but those religious groups that were counterbalancing the king, so that those family lines, that ancestor worship, gets pushed out. And one guise under which you can do that is democracy, empowering the people, whereas actually what you're doing is disempowering the only threat to your standing. And he goes over how this is the case in America as well. The Ford Foundation fund a lot of these democratic organizations in America, quote-unquote pro-democracy. As he goes through, all of them basically admit that what they're going to actually do is empower people who actually have power to maintain democracy. Okay, so we start to see that this is not just about empowering the people, this is about selecting a very specific set of organizations that they, either through malice or ignorance believe will further democracy, will further the power of the people, and in actuality just further their own power. And, that shows you when you tend to see a big push towards democracy, by people in power, which is, why people have such a positive immediate reaction to the word democracy. That tends to be because there is a central power structure which is threatened by somewhat smaller ones that wants to make sure that they don't ever actually gain enough power to overthrow the central authority. Obviously, you see reflexes of this in mass media today, the consolidated 8 companies that control, I think, 50% of all media in America, making sure that they're not threatened by independent media, right? These people, Twitter used to be the Wild West, for example, and a lot of media got spread through Twitter, but nowadays Twitter is just like basically a receptacle for news organizations. How did that take place? Well, it's, too complicated to analyze in one video, but you certainly see that there is a central power structure threatened by a middle one that ends up, taking a hold of them. Perhaps off the pretense, in that case, of superior epistemology, epistemological exaltation. The media knows best. Random Twitter people, they're dangerous. They could be spreading misinformation. And we see that too, the aversion to misinformation, to quote-unquote misinformation. We see that as well. A lot of what independent media would say on Twitter gets pretty readily threatened by the central forces of mass media, because they're definitely threatened by them, especially in the era of the internet, right? You see this everywhere, and this structure tends to be the background for democracy, or these, more broadly, these sorts of hyper-real reactions to words. So we've gotten very, very far away from the original point, but we got to all this by saying, who supplanted that moral power vacuum left behind by Christianity in America? And we just did a big, long discussion on look at all these concepts that people have an almost religious affiliation towards, democracy, racism, hate crime, stuff like that. how does it come about that people have this moralistic, hyper-religious reaction to it? Well, it's because structures of power like the media, mass media as a whole, I think you can include, and even the government, educational institutions, etc., who are funded by the government, they all sort of assert that these semiotes, these signs, racism, anti-democratic stuff, threats to the media, they assert that these are all harmful. They emit that order. And I would argue the only way they could get that amount of religious power is by being the ones who supplanted the actual religious authority back then. That is, phrased in simpler terms, there was a moral power vacuum left behind by, the gradual decline of Christianity in America, and it ended up being filled by what we call the Cathedral. These organizations that end up replacing Christianity in America, we call the Cathedral. The level of religious zeal that people previously had within Christianity is now transubstantiated into this left-wing, that is to say, pro-media, pro-wealth, pro-neoliberalism, etc. worldview. We call those groups the Cathedral as a whole, and mostly the Cathedral is mass media, but it also includes the educational institutions funded by the government, many sectors of the government outside of the very center of the government, some of the people who fund the government. Obviously, lobbyists are a very important force in the legislative branch, perhaps certain impetuses in the judicial branch, right? Why are people legal realists instead of legal formalists? We see it everywhere, these organizations that use power to push semiotic changes, to push cultural changes, and in doing so, empower themselves. And I would argue, coming back to this thing about American greatness, that the Cathedral that we see here, who replaced the religious status of America, obviously, their metaphysics is very confused. It's just about whatever helps people in power at the given moment, right? And that's so confused and peripatetic, it's never really a good basis for a societal metaphysic. But it's what everybody relies on today, and it, changes constantly. Like, say, the transgender agenda, that didn't even exist before 2015. It came into existence in that very moment, because at that moment it seems that power was being threatened by whatever the absolute antithesis to a transgender agenda would be. I don't know specifically what that was in 2015, but it tends to be that when power really, really care about something, it's not because everybody in power just happened to rationally decide on it. It tends to be because people in power benefit from it. Or at least that's a good heuristic. People will not do things that hurt their own standing in power. And we see that, for example, transgender agenda get promoted to an almost unknown degree of propagation. 5 years? That's not a long time, but in that time span, it went from complete irrelevance to one of the core social issues for the left wing in America and abroad, which is very, very interesting. So that's one very good example. Of course, it's sort of hard to trace who really gets helped by the transgender agenda. Maybe, it's those pills that they sell, although I've always been apprehensive to that explanation, that it's all about, estrogen. That probably doesn't make them a ton of money. Maybe it's that a strong family structure was very threatening. Maybe it's because substantiating gender as an identity instead of a social construct means that there's kind of a semiotic vacancy that's a very powerful thing to fill. I don't know what it was in particular. Maybe it was to create a new moral issue that made churches and certain conservative institutions that tend to be in the middle less threatening and easier to insult as being, unethical. It could have been any number of those, but we see a very unnatural rate of growth for the transgender agenda, and a rate of promotion that's virtually unheard of. It's sort of similar to what you saw with the demonization of fat and the exaltation of sugar by the ACA in America through the 60s and 70s. It's like that degree of mass refocusing on the level of mass media. But, so yeah, referring back, we see the Cathedral, they really fill that moral power vacuum. And I would say that that takes away that other side of the dialectic, the antithesis to pure Faustian development, to pure Faustian expansion and conquest, which was ordered liberty, which has unfortunately been supplanted by this, again, the Cathedral. And I think that's part of why you see a lot of recent inventions, a lot of recent development in our economy. Only a paucity of it is really oriented towards that 0 to 1 innovation that Peter Thiel describes, and a lot more of it is about, individual decadence, say pornography, say mass media, mass consumption, this sort of a thing. Tesla's World Wireless project was not about mass consumption. Highways, at least under the Lincoln Highway system, were not about mass consumption. Skyscrapers certainly weren't at all. They were about, expressing our power. I think one of the earliest descriptions of skyscrapers was like plumes of smoke emerging out of the ocean as you cross and begin to see Ellis Island, which is really a fun description of it. But no, it's a way to show our power, our strength as a civilization. Building massive buildings in the Art Deco style, we didn't have to do that. We could just make boring Soviet stuff if we wanted. We did it because it expresses our power. Sadly, we've lost that view of ordered liberty, the positive vision of we're going somewhere as a culture. We're not just developing for no reason. We're not just expanding towards infinity in completely random directions as socially atomized, completely pre-societal individuals. We're really something bigger, but sadly we've lost that spirit. Now we think of ourselves as purely pre-rational individuals. There's kind of a nihilistic treatment of a lot of the things that made America very, very powerful at once, that made America really, really productive at once. And the Cathedral does nothing but accelerate that movement away from care about the group, from an understanding of ordered liberty, and towards the misunderstanding of liberty that is purely negative, purely individualistic, and decadent libertarianism that we see today. And that really makes the whole prospect of inventions, of creativity, of production, of expansion and conquest, it makes all of that very difficult. It makes all of it virtually infeasible. So the first step towards really getting back to that state of America where we have greatness, the first step towards making America great again, is to return to that state in our culture where through Christendom we had a kind of a cosmology and metaphysic that permitted for development that's completely expansionary and progressive and oriented towards infinity, but isn't just decadent, that isn't just, about the atomized individual. Right? I mean, take that word progressive. What did progressive mean for Teddy Roosevelt? While I don't agree with a lot of it, it was very different from what progressive means today. Because, and unfortunately, people in the reactionary and conservative spheres today have kind of soured to that term, progressive, but really, it can be extremely productive. Really, what I believe they've actually soured to is the spirit of progressivism today, which is exceptionally weak and unproductive, almost. That only cares about the atomized individual and therefore doesn't really go anywhere. Graph go up, but not a lot of 0-to-1 innovation as Peter Thiel describes it. The way we get back to that is by reorienting ourselves with a broader, more complete and cohesive metaphysic that permits us to counteract that pure expansion, pure hypertrophy of the individual, to counteract it with something that's a real metaphysical orientation. A goal that's not just an individual's will or impetus, but the will or impetus of the self-determination of the group, right? Of the self-determination of your culture, of your civilization, of your people, stuff like that. It's a long process to get back there because unfortunately today the Cathedral have quite a bit of power, but I think more practically speaking, the way that you change this is by having, good people, and we're seeing a lot of this more today. But good people who understand the importance of ordered liberty, who understand this sort of worldview, this sort of reactionary worldview, getting them into positions of power, which we're seeing accelerate quite a bit in recent times, thank God. People like Peter Thiel, people like, perhaps even Elon Musk, right? But, Elon Musk kind of is almost a meme at this point. I don't know if I want to say that he's the guy we should be looking up to. Certainly Peter Thiel is. I would say John McAfee might be up there, all these people. Getting people like this into positions of power is how we start to change society in a way that allows for America to return to greatness. Not just returning to the security of the 50s, but returning to the real, internationally unique and productive and progressive America that we had from 1890 to 1939. So that's this video, a little bit rambly, but it's fun for me to make, and I hope it's fun to watch. I hope it's enjoyable. I hope I conferred at least a little information, but cheers guys, have a good, and that'll be all for me today. New video out in probably a couple days.